we see the federal government not get involved and specifically say, we're not going to go forward and charge Jeffrey Epstein.
It's mind-boggling. How does a judge sign off on something like this? This is corruption at the highest levels.
After you're done with all of that, you still get to be on the president's jet. The president's jet is apparently less secure than a middle school, which Jeffrey Epstein wouldn't have been allowed to be near because he was, guess what, a registered sex offender. I feel like it's like Europa, the final countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You know, we need some hairband back.
Absolutely. And I just got a message on our screen that says recording is very high quality. So
that's just because there's high quality people on the recording.
There is. And let's jump right in and let's get after this because there's a lot of warts on this pig. And the fact that we are talking about Jeffrey Epstein in a way that is outside of pedophilia, sex trafficking of young women. And we are going to get into this whole exploration of, and as I said before, things that this guy did that were so far beyond the things that are reported in the mainstream media. So I don't want to steal your thunder because I think much like Thor, you are the god of thunder. And I want you to drop the hammer. So I'm gonna let you run with this one, man.
When we talked about doing the Epstein episode, I said, let's first see if there's anything that hasn't been covered before, because we've seen a lot about Epstein. We've seen the trafficking issues. We've seen a lot of conspiracy theories coming forward about Epstein. And I wanted to have the opportunity to dive deeper because perhaps there's some uncharted territory here. And, you know, when I got back to you, Sean, I was absolutely astounded by the information that I uncovered that needed to be pieced together from multiple different sources and has not been widely reported. And I think ultimately, when you uncover the story of Jeffrey Epstein, it is not one of the offenses that were committed in 2002 to 2005. The real story is one of amassing wealth. Now, here was the first kernel of information that I saw that made me incredibly suspicious of the mainstream reports of Jeffrey Epstein. There are commentators all over the place saying, we don't know how he made his money. We're curious how he made his money. He's a billionaire, they said, but we're not sure how he made it. Now, even in the 90s, even in the 80s, making money on Wall Street that was unrecorded and unknown, it's kind of impossible. I mean, it's possible that you're working in the dark pools or, you know, something like that where your trades aren't really recorded. But for the most part, the SEC requires filings on everything. So I thought to myself, how is it that a guy like Jeffrey Epstein could earn a bunch of money, but nobody really knows how he made it? So that was the first thing that I wanted to look at. The question that was presented was, how did Jeffrey Epstein make money? So let's go back to it. Jeffrey Epstein, going back very far, he was a professor for a while. That was kind of well known. Some people have said he's a teacher. I think that they modified that to sort of align with this trafficking story. But the reality was he was a professor. He's a finance guy. He knew finance. And as somebody who loves finance myself, you know, I kind of understand that he was captured in the fact that there's this tremendous amount of wealth in the 70s and 80s, and particularly the 80s during the Reagan administration, the bond market and everything, very attractive to intelligent people. And that's right where Jeffrey Epstein was. It's a fantastic place. If anybody's seen Wall Street, it's a fantastic place for a young, enterprising guy. But it is also a place where people can get themselves into a lot of trouble, because there's a lot of money to be made. There's a lot of greed to be had. So he ends up at Bear Stearns, a place that if you're young and hungry and you want to work long hours and you're able to trade, you will do well. But at some point, he gets terminated from Bear Stearns because he was engaged in unethical practices. Now, getting terminated for unethical practices at a place like Bear Stearns is kind of like having too much sex in a whorehouse. It's not usually something that happens, right? Like, how the hell is Bear Stearns going to terminate somebody for unethical practices? Back in the 80s, they didn't even really have a compliance department. And Sean, the compliance guy, knows that compliance has only changed. Drastically since the 1980s, right?
It's amazing to me how somebody who is a producer of high wealth and who has, if you will, maybe he didn't have it at Bear Stearns, but definitely the niche list of clients that this guy had as he moved into his next ventures, which I know you're going to talk about, Tower and some of these other ones. Something else had to be going on, because it wasn't like the SEC got involved. It wasn't like he was banned from Wall Street by the SEC. And you know what's really, I was thinking about this the other day. He just brought up the movie Wall Street, right? Wasn't Wall Street all about the takeover of an airline?
It was Blue Star, and then we also had Anacott Steel, remember?
Anacott Steel.
Anacott Steel loves Blue Oyster. Well, yeah, remember Martin Sheen? This was great. Martin Sheen plays the blue-collar airline union man, and Charlie Sheen, I mean, they got the father-son dynamic down exactly right. He's the quick money young guy. He thinks high of himself, but he's going too fast, and Martin Sheen can't stop him. And guess what ended up happening with Charlie Sheen and Martin Sheen? Charlie Sheen went way too fast and fizzled out. And Martin Sheen's probably, I don't know if he's still alive, but he's like doing movies up until he died or until now.
He's been doing the Netflix series where he and the guy, Sam, oh God, I can't think of his name, from Law and Order, the attorney, the guy with the big eyebrows.
Oh, yeah.
They were on a show with Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin, where Martin Sheen was married to one of them and the other guy was married to the other, and Martin and Sam, whatever his name was, became lovers. It's actually kind of a funny show. But it kind of shows you, yeah, you're right. I mean, Martin Sheen, I mean, you know,
prophetic.
It's the tortoise. It's the tortoise and the hare story, right? Charlie Sheen ran and ran and ran until he ran out of tiger blood, and Martin Sheen is still running on the tortoise speed.
That's exactly right. So Epstein gets fired for Bear Stearns, and then he finds a guy named Hoffenberg. Hoffenberg does not come up very much when you look up the Jeffrey Epstein thing, which is the shocking thing. And when you dive a little deeper, you see a lot of government involvement, a lot of cover-up, and the most strange story ever. Let me just give everybody a preview of this. There are two separate sets of victims in this story: financial crime victims and underage crimes. Let's just say that, because I think there's some words we're not allowed to say, but underage crime victims. In this instance, in this one case, both sets of victims were not properly notified of the deals that were struck. Both sets of victims, there was no attempt to make them whole, and they were essentially disregarded. And both sets of victims actually had to go into federal court as victims and say, something's wrong here. And those were victims of Jeffrey Epstein specifically. So let's go to Hoffenberg. He's not a victim, but he was part of it.
And by the way, he is a horrible guy. Steve Hoffenberg is a horrible guy. He is one of, or was one of the worst human beings on the face of the earth.
I think it was the passing of the torch. Yeah. So Steve Hoffenberg owns a company called Tower Financial. Epstein goes into Tower Financial. Sean, it sounds like you've got some knowledge of the specific deals that went down. I'm going to go over some of them, but certainly if there are others, like, let's jump in and hear about them because they're so fascinating. Jeffrey Epstein jumps into Tower Financial, and here's the essence of what this company was. They would go and purchase distressed companies, or they would purchase the debt of companies, and then they would end up collecting on the debt of the companies. And that was their way of making money. They could buy it on low dollar. They could play shell games and put it into other companies. And this was kind of the Wild West, and they made a ton of money doing it. Well, they were tired of just making money that way. So what they decided to do was start getting into some bigger deals. And of course, bigger deals require a lot of capital. And by capital, I mean money. And so at some point, they decided that they wanted to try to buy Pan Am. Pan Am was the airline of the 1950s where everybody wanted to be a Pan Am pilot, including Catch Me If You Can. I think you've got it.
Leonardo DiCaprio.
Leonardo DiCaprio. Yeah. They tried to buy Pan Am because it was distressed. And I think, as a corporate raider would do, you've got a lot of airplanes, you've got terminals that are probably set up. You could probably move another airline in. You could probably structure that company, get rid of some of the debt and broker that deal so it's attractive to a larger airline and make a huge amount of money doing it. But the thing that you have to do is make sure that as soon as you put your hands on that entity, it doesn't immediately lose value. Otherwise, you lose a ton of money. And that's a big risk for a distressed company. You're trying to catch a falling knife and it might just stab you in the hand. That's the problem. And that's exactly what happened with Jeffrey Epstein and Steve Hoffenberg. They tried to catch a falling knife with Pan Am and a couple of other deals, and they lost a ton. Well, what do financiers do? What do these types of people do when they lose a ton of money? They try to get it off the books. They try to make it look like they didn't lose. They try to get other investors whipped up to give money so that they can try to leverage that. This is gambling, and this is just like somebody who lost at the tables striking a shady business deal to get cash so they can go back to the tables. Gambling is one motivation for criminal activity. I've represented defendants who've lost a lot gambling and they needed to get more money back, and crime is one way to do it. Screwing people over, bad loans, that sort of thing. And that's what Hoffenberg and Epstein elected to do. In the end, Sean, there are some 200,000 victims who gave money to Jeffrey Epstein as a financier. And this, let me just go back and say, everything that I am telling you is directly sourced from legitimate news reports, from books, from actual videos of actual witnesses talking, not secondhand or third-hand information, but actual sourced reporting from legitimate sources. We're not going into the depths of the conspiracy theories on the internet. We're talking about mainstream stuff here. And in fact, when we get a little further down and talk about Vince Foster, there's actual archives from the White House chief counsel's office that we were able to review to uncover some of this information. So 200,000 victims, and that's who we know about, gave Epstein and Hoffenberg money and didn't get it back. Now, the common number that we see put out there was that Hoffenberg swindled $460 million from investors. This is where this is just maybe a gut feeling by me, and there's no reporting on this, but I feel that the number has to be much larger than $460 million, right? Epstein was known to not do small deals. He only did big deals. He was known to only work with wealthy people who gave him all of their money. And while he may not have used all of it for fraudulent purposes, the likelihood is that if you had 200,000 people that were giving over money, that's a tremendous amount, that the number would be much higher. And of course, one of the things attorneys do in these types of situations is they negotiate and try to make the value of the fraud, the amount of the fraud, look lower. And it seems like the government was willing to bend over backwards for Hoffenberg and Jeffrey Epstein at the time. So it wouldn't be surprising to me if that was the number that was reported as being the loss amount, but the government was conveniently dropping that down a bit because, as you will see, they weren't respecting the victims and they weren't respecting the lost property by the victims and they weren't moving forward and collecting it. Sean, I think at this point, do you recall any other deals that they engaged in that might be helpful to jump into?
I think a couple of things. One, I agree with one of the statements that you made a moment ago, which is the amounts that they swindled people from had to be significantly higher. I mean, we're talking about 200,000 people. Mm-hmm. But even beyond that, Jeffrey Epstein in the circles that he kept, $460 million doesn't get you into the circles with Sir Richard Branson. It doesn't get you into the circles with the Clintons. It doesn't get you into the circles with Sir Douglas Leaks. It doesn't get you into the circles with some of the people that you're going to hear about as we talk through this topic. But there are some other things. And I think one of the first things that people need to understand is Hoffenberg, Tower Financial, was a debt collection company. Okay. So right out of the gate, we know that we're dealing with pretty scuzzy people because they take the debt of other organizations and they go after people in some of the most unscrupulous ways. And thank goodness that laws have evolved over the years to be able, like the Consumer Protection Agency, to be able to protect people, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
But what Hoffenberg was known for doing is going in and taking over these smaller companies, using their credit to acquire as much stuff as he possibly could, and then give the finger, if you will, to all of the debt collectors.
Yeah.
And this is a guy who owned a debt collection agency. So, I mean, we're talking about a bad guy. But here's the thing. I love that you brought up Pan Am because, you know, I have a background in aviation. One of my very good close friends growing up, his dad, prior to his passing, was a captain on a 747 flying international routes for Pan Am. And I was always fascinated with Pan Am. And it's still around today. There's T-shirts, there's bags, there's all kinds of stuff, right? It's become this cult following Pan Am. But there's a couple of things. So in order for Pan Am as a purchase to work out, what they had to do, and when I say they, I'm talking about Epstein and Hoffenberg, what they were supposed to do based on the regulators' requirements is they had to put $3 million into these two insurance companies. But instead, they put the $3 million into Pan Am. And where the story really starts is that Epstein and Hoffenberg were going to take over two insurance companies. One was called Associated Life, and the other one was United Fire. And this is where the schemes really began, because the regulators, as I started to say a moment ago, they wanted them to infuse, right? Because that's the term we use, capital infusion, into these two companies to make them more solvent, to make them stable, if you will. But what they did was they used those assets from these two companies to buy Pan American Airlines. And the problem with that is it didn't work out. So they then looked at another company, another aviation company called Emory Air Freight. And what they did was they used market manipulation and they forged documents with the regulators to try to make these companies look better than what they were. So what they did, and where the scheme really starts, is they were selling promissory notes with the promises of these outrageous returns that there was absolutely no way they can ever be paid out. And the last of them, and then we'll get into all these really crazy, people that pop up. I think the downfall for Hoffenberg, if you will, was when Mario Cuomo, what was Cuomo? He was the mayor of New York, right?
I believe at the time, yeah.
He urged Hoffenberg to buy the New York Post. Mm-hmm. And that really was where all the problems for Hoffenberg started. That's where all of the warts started to, pop up on the skin of this pig.
It was an attempt to be legitimate. So that's a fantastic deep dive, Sean. Let's get into some of the victims, okay? Because in each area of this, there were victims. So first, I guess just to go a bit back into the hiring, Hoffenberg was later prosecuted and then very outspoken about Jeffrey Epstein. And the way that he said he was introduced was that he was introduced by a British arms dealer. He was introduced to Epstein by a British arms dealer, Douglas, I believe it's pronounced Lease. And I guess this guy said, Epstein's a genius. He's great at selling securities and he's got no moral compass. That was the phrase, right? And of course, Hoffenberg is a guy trying to get on his way up. I mean, he'd been around for a long time, but what he really wanted was some sort of genius to be able to, just like Madoff did, entice these other people to give money. Because if you had the person, you were likely to strike the deals. And so Hoffenberg's going to be the background guy, and Epstein is going to be the quote unquote genius and be a forward facing person. The reason I say all of that is because at some point there's an attempt to distance Hoffenberg from Epstein. And the real big problem with trying to create distance between the two is this was a 1-2 punch. It very clearly was a 1-2 punch in the financial arena, which is why these victims were ultimately harmed by both. Okay. So you've got the two insurance companies that you mentioned, Sean. Those insurance companies faltered. And as a result of them faltering, 4,000 Illinois customers were swindled out of $9 million that had been set aside to cover medical bills. Another 2,200 Ohio customers lost about 1.8 million. Now, how many counts of indictment were filed against Jeffrey Epstein in relation to that scheme? 0. So right there, right now, we have a crime that absolutely would be prosecuted by any prosecutor, could have been taken up by a Chicago U.S. attorney, could have been taken up by an Ohio U.S. attorney, could have been taken up by the DOJ, no prosecution. Well, of course, they get away with that and they're not done. Beginning in 1988, they began selling more than 270 million worth of promissory notes, offering returns. Mind you, this is undisputed. I'm actually reading directly from a Washington Post article right now that's out there. Beginning in 1988, Towers began selling more than 270 million of promissory notes, offering returns of 12 to 16% and marketing them to people of modest means. So they've got their sellers there on the phone, reaching out to people. Hey, got this wonderful thing, safe place for your money, 12 to 16%. Hey, I understand your wife, you may want to talk to your wife, but honestly, you ever seen 12 to 16% before? I mean, this is real. You got to strike now. And they get these people to buy it. People of modest means. Why do we target people of modest means? That's Jeffrey Epstein's MO. He goes after the downtrodden, the poor, the people who don't have a great upbringing, and the people who don't have the type of relationship with those in authority where they would trust going to them and saying, this powerful man screwed me out of money. If they could even find out that Jeffrey Epstein was behind it, right? And in many cases, you're going to do a great job concealing your tracks. So you've got those people swindled out of $270 million. And Hoffenberg used several million dollars from those investors to show Illinois regulators that they were putting sufficient capital into the insurance companies that they purchased. But the money wasn't available to pay claims. And what happens when an insurance company can't pay claims? They falsely deny them, causing people an insane amount of injury. You need this surgery. You need this whatever. Your insurance denies it. And this was health insurance. And if they deny it, you got to come out of pocket. The people from registration at the hospital show up and say, hi, how are we going to be able to cover the cost of our surgery today? And when it's not insurance, it's cash, or it's we'll show you the door unless it's emergency room EMTALA sort of stuff, right?
Or you fit into a charity care situation.
Exactly. So at some point, a U.S. attorney does get a hold of this situation. Here's where it gets interesting, Sean. Federal prosecutor Edward Kohler is out of Chicago, Illinois. He walked Hoffenberg, who had just agreed to cooperate with the government, through the design of the scheme. In the narrative, Kohler laid out, along with Hoffenberg, who at that point was cooperating, I'm fast forwarding, he was charged, agreed to cooperate. They went through in detail Epstein's role as the quote unquote technical wizard who kept the money moving around to support Hoffenberg's various schemes. Hoffenberg was not capable of doing this before. He was capable with Jeffrey Epstein, and they went forward and they swindled people out of a ton of money, as we've already proven. And the strange thing here is we got a federal prosecutor who's hot on the case, but as you may all know, there's no charges. So in front of a grand jury in Chicago, Kohler walks through this entire scheme, names Epstein specifically as being involved, says that there's $460 million that these victims were swindled out of, and that there are 200,000 victims. Hoffenberg gets indicted and convicted. He pled guilty in 1995 to 5 criminal charges. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but publicly, he referred to Epstein as the architect of the plan. And I wouldn't just trust Hoffenberg. I mean, prosecutors are completely fine in trusting somebody who's cooperated with the government, right? That there are no strangers to that. I don't. I'm a defense attorney. Cooperators, you need something corroborating that. Well, what corroborates that? Epstein was employed there. Epstein made like so much money during this entire time period. And a lot of people are curious as to how it was made, but it could only have been made through his efforts with Hoffenberg. And there was no other explanation for a legitimate source of funds for Jeffrey Epstein during this time period. And so we are only left to reason that Hoffenberg and Epstein make a ton of money, that Hoffenberg gets caught, and Epstein keeps the money. There were no forfeitures ever, and that's the way the government takes money from an individual. Let's go over forfeitures briefly, Sean. I know it's something you know a lot about as well, but when the government believes fraud has committed, they have the ability to take the proceeds of fraud back, and they can issue restitution to victims. Everybody knows about restitution. Most of us think it's like paying the city for the spray paint that, somebody put on the wall and you got to clean it up. But restitution is mandatory in cases where somebody is charged, which means that all you have to do is charge them, prove the value of the fraud, and then you can take the money from them and give it to the victims. And in fact, the law says that you have to give it to the victims. Why? Because it's their money. And if somebody's committed a crime, they need to be made whole first, because that's one of the purposes. Now, a U.S. attorney, Edward Kohler, decided not to put Jeffrey Epstein on an indictment, which means he decided not to attack Jeffrey Epstein's money, which means Jeffrey Epstein gets to keep the money. And to make matters worse, he didn't even civilly sue Jeffrey Epstein to say, hey, listen, we know you were a legitimate businessman or just following orders, Nuremberg defense, or whatever you're going to say. But in the end, this is money gained from fraud, so we're going to sue you and get that back. It wasn't even that. None of the tools that he had at his disposal he used to get Epstein back. So Epstein wasn't indicted in the Towers financial case, despite the fact that his association with Hoffenberg was incredibly well documented, which means none of the victims get their money. Well, these victims are a little different, Sean. They didn't stay quiet. And at some point later, some of these 200,000 victims, it was a class, it was a few of the victims decided to sue on behalf of all of them. It's not 200,000 people getting together to sue, but they formed a class and they decided to sue Jeffrey Epstein because he was never named. They thought that this was curious as well. They filed a lawsuit, and that lawsuit was dismissed several days later. But why was it dismissed? Based on the information that I was able to pull, they dismissed it themselves. Now, how does that happen, Sean? You've got 200,000 victims suing the federal government, and they decide to dismiss their own lawsuit. Any guesses?
I'm boggled on this one.
It's very, very curious. Well, there's a few ways or a few reasons why somebody, and this is just educated guess here, a few reasons why somebody might want to dismiss a lawsuit. First, maybe it's not well founded on the law. And maybe somebody points that out to you. This was a lawsuit, I believe, against Epstein and the federal government. Maybe there's a statute of limitations violation, certainly. But maybe there's a settlement. Maybe there's a threat. Maybe support for the lawsuit is lost very quickly. Or maybe there's some sort of technical defect. But the first few reasons that I gave you, you would just recircle the wagons and refile, right? You would try to find something else. But the other thing that we don't see here is when Bernie Madoff was indicted, when even Bernie Madoff was arrested, we had victims coming out of the woodwork. When FTX went down and Sam Bankman-Fried, he was the most popular name on the internet. Most of my news hits at that time were talking about this guy. Like, I go into my studio to sit down and talk to the news, and the wife is like, what, SBF again? I'm like, yeah, I can't get away from the guy. Like, we're doing nothing but talking about SBF. Who was talking about Jeffrey Epstein and his fraud at the time? Who was talking about Hoffenberg at the time? The victims were quiet.
Yep.
Incredibly suspicious stuff, Sean. So
it is. And, here's the other thing. Jeffrey Epstein continuously stated that, listen, before all of these major events were perpetrated against these people, I left Tower Financial. I was gone.
Yeah.
This is all on Hoffenberg. And what's even more interesting is, Hoffenberg had some arrangements with the federal government, and they took their deal off the table from this guy.
Yep.
because he continuously in their comments, he lied again and again and again. Maybe he did lie because, again, we're talking about somebody who's a piece of dirt. And I don't think anybody could disagree with that.
Yeah.
But is it possible by this point in time that Jeffrey Epstein's circle with certain political people, certain individuals with significant influence was now starting to become very, very prevalent, and people were starting to become aware of that?
That's the segue of the century, Mr. Weiss. It absolutely is the segue of the century because...
And that was unscripted.
That's exactly what happened. So a slight rewind, and then we're going to hit exactly what you're talking about because I think it's important. You mentioned that Hoffenberg had his cooperation deal taken away. The circumstances of that were quite curious as well. So prior to 1991, Hoffenberg, Tower Financial is under SEC investigation. At that time, Epstein did work there, right? In 1993, the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, which is like the SEAL Team 6 of U.S. attorneys' offices, began a criminal investigation against Hoffenberg and others for conspiracy to obstruct the SEC investigation in 1991 and 92. Remember, I was talking about the Chicago investigation. In Chicago, they were about ready to nail both Epstein and Hoffenberg. But in the Southern District of New York, they were just looking at Hoffenberg. And I imagine SEAL Team 6 took over the case and decided to move forward and told Chicago to hold on, right? So September 23rd, 1993, Hoffenberg and the government enter into a cooperation agreement. And Hoffenberg then agreed to be charged with conspiracy and a few other things. Every defendant who enters into that agreement has to agree to tell the truth. You have to sit down and tell the truth. What truth? Well, it's the truth that the U.S. Attorney's Office wants you to tell. You can't tell the other truth, the one that you have held dear for a long time. You got to get rid of that truth, and you got to tell the official truth, the one that helps the government prove their case. So in 1993, the SEC asserted that Hoffenberg wasn't cooperating with that investigation and it obstructed it. In 1994, the government met with Hoffenberg and put him on notice that they believed he violated the agreement and that he wasn't being truthful with them. Sure, that happens. I've had that happen. But then later on, they just completely rip that off of the table. Here's the important part, though. The non-cooperation was due to the SEC investigation. There was no mention of him not fully cooperating against Epstein and talking about what Epstein did. And that's why I'm very happy that you brought that up, because there was a motion that was filed by Hoffenberg's attorneys, and it said, hey, make the government comply with its deal. We didn't violate it, right? And so this was all publicly displayed before the court in a motions filing. And the court ultimately said that the attempt to compel this credit for cooperation was premature. But through that filing, we are very clear here that the government thinks Hoffenberg didn't comply with SEC requirements, disclosing financial documents. Maybe he manufactured some documents, hid some evidence. And I think that goes back to what we talked about initially. He was probably trying to make the fraud look like it was a lot less so he could keep some of his financial assets. Scrooge wants to keep the money.
I mean, it makes sense. It makes perfect sense.
That's it. So now, right on the prophetic statement that you made earlier, why do we not go after Epstein? It's because Epstein is a smart guy and he's a tactician. And it's also because he knew that somebody who'd gained the White House at that time was a potentially compromised individual where he could get in. And he also knew that there were a few people who were surrounding that person in the White House at the time who were potentially compromised individuals, and he could find his way in. Jeffrey Epstein's a deal maker. He just needs to find a crack, right? And he found a crack in Bill Clinton's White House. Now, Bill Clinton was elected president, and he came from Arkansas. I'm actually going to be in Arkansas tonight, ironically. After we finish this, I jump on a plane. I'm not going there to research this. I happen to have a case out there. But ironically, I've never been to Arkansas. And the day that I talk about it on a podcast, I'm also going there. So that's fun. Maybe it's fate.
If I don't hear from you for a few days, I'm going to start my search in Arkansas.
Please do. Please do. If you don't hear from me, it's probably because nobody wants this to air, right? Especially what I'm about to say next.
Yeah, this is ugly.
So Bill Clinton brings a lot of his people into the White House. There's all sorts of allegations against Bill Clinton. I'm not going to talk about body counts. We're not going to go into, all of the stuff that everybody's heard before. This is a bit different, and it's how Jeffrey Epstein found his way in. So when Bill Clinton gains the White House, him and Hillary bring their friends. There was a guy named Vince Foster who was brought into the White House. Vince Foster wasn't really a special guy. He wasn't really a White House caliber person. He was brought into the White House along with quite a few other people that were part of Clinton's cabinet to perform certain jobs. And what were they doing there? Well, they were in theory part of the White House counsel's office, but it seemed like these were more the kind of crony favors that you might give out to people. Well, we have a guy named Vince Foster and then another guy, and this is going to be important. Let me pull up the news article because this is a very tragic case. We've got Mark Middleton. Have you heard about Mark Middleton before, Sean?
I've not heard it. No.
Now, this is a bit of a strange story. So I'll get back to Epstein in a second, but we need a detour on Mark Middleton. So Mark Middleton was 59 years old, and he served in the Clinton White House in the 1990s. On May 2nd, 2022, he was found dead on Heifer Ranch in Perryville, Arkansas. Almost a year after his death, a police report obtained by, I think it was the NY Post, ironically, revealed that the Little Rock businessman was discovered with a gunshot wound to the chest and an extension cord tied around his neck to a tree, but no gun found on site. That's quite suspicious. That's something that we need to get to the bottom of.
Let me guess, and it was labeled a homicide. A suicide.
I think it was, but I don't actually know. I think we'd have to go look at the autopsy report, and I didn't pull that. But here's the strange thing about Mark Middleton. I believe he previously worked for like a family heating and air conditioning business back in Arkansas before he was tapped to go work at the White House. Air conditioning to White House. Air conditioning to White House. Why? We have no idea. What is Mark Middleton's connection to the Epstein case? Well, it just so happens that when Mark Middleton was working at the White House, he notably signed Jeffrey Epstein into the White House 17 times. Jeffrey Epstein, between 1993, the start of the Hoffenberg investigation, and 2005, actually it was between 1993 and 1995, the end of the investigation when Hoffenberg pleads guilty and agrees to cooperate. Mark Middleton signed Jeffrey Epstein in a whopping 17 times. Middleton left the White House in 1995, so all of these signatures on the logs happened between 1993 and 1995. And the Los Angeles Times later reported that he left the White House in 1995, which was before Bill Clinton's term ended, because his executive access was curtailed after an investigation determined that he abused his connections in an effort to become an international deal maker. All right. Epstein was largely known to be an international deal maker. Remember, he was introduced to Hoffenberg by that gun dealer, the international arms dealer. And Epstein finds out about Middleton. Maybe there's some compromising information on this guy. And he says, hey, buddy, why don't you get me into the White House? Why? Well, my business partner's under investigation, and I don't really like federal investigations that much. So perhaps I can get in the White House, and maybe the fact that I've been in the White House so much makes it hard to indict me. Or maybe there's a way that I can get a favor from somebody high up in the Department of Justice, somebody who appointed the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, somebody who can ask the Attorney General to require the Southern District of New York U.S. Attorney to resign if they don't do what they want. Maybe I want to go see that person and see what the Wizard of Oz will have for me, and maybe we can work this out. Now, I will admit to you, Sean, I don't have any evidence that during that time, Epstein made contact with Bill Clinton. I don't have any evidence that at that time he made contact with Hillary. We have the actual logs showing the signatures 17 times between 93 and 95. And we also know that the White House is not really just a country club that anybody can go to. You have to have an official reason for being there, possibly a state dinner, or maybe even a meeting with the president. But we don't know what happened during those meetings. We just know that there was contact.
But what would it be? Let me ask you this question though. What would it be, honestly, during that period of time that Jeffrey Epstein had to offer the Clintons that would get him through that front door of the White House 17 times?
That's going to require some speculation. And while I don't mind it, I would certainly want to warn people that I'd be engaged in speculation as opposed to going for information. But if I had to speculate, I guess make an educated guess based on what I know about federal deals and federal prosecutors and whatnot, I would say this. Bill Clinton wasn't a clean guy. I think we all know that. I mean, he's been disbarred at this point. There was Whitewater. There was Travelgate. There were a significant number of investigations surrounding Bill Clinton. Epstein was pretty good at being like the Chuck Rhodes, if you've ever seen Billions, of his environment. He knew that the best way to get to somebody is to find something that compromised them. And we know that he immediately made contact with Hoffenberg. And we know that Hoffenberg was later disciplined for being a shady guy and removed from the White House. Well, what do we know about shady guys? They're easily enticed, right? Maybe we go wine and dine. I said Hoffenberg. I meant to say Middleton. Maybe we go wine and dine Mark Middleton. Maybe we introduce him to some girls. Maybe we take Middleton out and we do something compromising. Maybe we just have information that we're willing to share and we say, hey, get me in and get me access. And then once there's access, then we have something on the person we need to do a favor. We need to do the favor for us. And we discuss potentially disclosing that information. I don't know exactly what it would have been, but I would say that Vince Foster, Travelgate, and all of the information that was available around that time might have been the compromising thing that Epstein could have used in order to get access. It also might have been that Bill Clinton was a prior client of Epstein's, or Epstein had made some financial deals. Or perhaps if the Clinton Foundation was in existence back then, perhaps Epstein may have had some involvement or was offering future involvement in terms of making money or cleaning up for the Clintons. All speculation, but all good reasons.
Yeah, one thing as you were talking, I was looking into this Middleton, and it's really interesting because several of the news sources, and they are liberal news sources, and I'm putting it out there, have indicated that there was a shotgun that was actually found by Mark Middleton's body. But if you go and you look at these other very independent news sources, including those that are coming out of the UK as well, the concern that's raised is that this guy's body was hanged from a tree by an electrical cord with a gunshot wound, but yet it was ruled a suicide. And to your point, there was never a gun found according to these other independent sources. So here's what I challenge people to do. Before you start thinking to yourself, well, Bill Clinton was a wonderful president. Yeah, he had some bad things that he did with Monica Lewinsky and, this and that. Think about this. A person hanging from a tree doesn't have the ability to turn a shotgun to their chest and blow a hole in it. Nor do you have the ability to blow a hole in your chest and then tie a cord around your neck and hang yourself from a tree. I'm sorry. This is not a suicide. There's nothing you could ever say or do to convince me that this was a suicide.
Yep.
I am a pragmatic person. I am a man of common sense. And, there's a little saying that I always have, when, my kids were growing up, and now that they're adults, I get to say it a little bit differently. But I used to say, that when I thought they were lying to me about something, I would always say to them, that little speck at the top of bird poop, it's still bird poop.
Yep, that's true. Yeah.
This is a giant heaping pile of bird poop. And there's no way this was a suicide. You'll never convince me of that.
I think so. I mean, it happened so far after, though. We have no idea really who was involved or who was behind it. But it is quite crazy that death happens right around the time that Maxwell is going to trial or under scrutiny. Obviously, it happened a couple of years after Jeffrey Epstein's death, but it was really strange. And we know that this was the person who was directly responsible for Epstein's access to the White House, and likely would have been the person who would have had to answer questions under deposition or grand jury or even at trial of what was happening in the White House with Jeffrey Epstein when he went in. His testimony was not necessary in a trial of Jeffrey Epstein because, guess what? He died, right? His testimony wasn't brought in against Maxwell because I can't remember exactly the date of Maxwell's trial, but regardless, Maxwell was not Epstein and wouldn't have had knowledge, likely, of some of the ongoings. There are pictures of Bill Clinton and also Epstein along with Maxwell in the White House, but until she goes to trial and is convicted, she's got a Fifth Amendment right and doesn't have to say anything about that. So Middleton ends up being kind of ground zero for information that would connect Jeffrey Epstein and the Clintons. Now, let's go into those visits. 1993 to 1995, Middleton signs Jeffrey Epstein in. Most of the visits were to the West Wing, making it likely that he met the president. That's the visitor's log that he was in. Epstein visited the White House 12 times in 1994 alone when the investigation was going on. 4 visits in less than a week in April. And for some of the visits, the president's schedule showed that he wasn't at the White House, but for some of the visits, it showed that he was at the White House at the time. So why is he visiting without the president being there? Who's he meeting with? Why is he visiting with the president there? Who's he meeting with? We don't know. But we do know that it's likely he met with the president, okay? Now, the trial of Maxwell began November 2021. Middleton is still alive at the time, based on my information, at least in the reporting that I've seen. Why is he not called? Again, I'm not so sure, but maybe there was no relevant information. But we do know that at that time, there was a lot coming up about the Epstein case. So after leaving office, the relationship between Bill Clinton and Epstein is not over. Bill Clinton notably flies on the private jet, at least 26 times, flight logs from Epstein's plane shows. I think 10 of those trips were with no Secret Service detail, no federal law enforcement on the plane. Now, I got to imagine that if you are the president and you're flying, or even if you're former president, you don't want Secret Service detail, you have to specifically ask that Secret Service detail not be there. I'm not going to go into what was happening on that plane or any allegations that Bill Clinton was doing anything untoward. I actually think that Joe Rogan covers this quite well. He says there are 2 types of people. There are people who like power, and there are people who like this other P word, right? And I'm not going to say that word. And maybe Bill Clinton is somebody that's, that likes the other P word. I don't know. Maybe he likes both. But I think that was quite a crude way to say it. We're not going to be like Joe Rogan necessarily on this podcast.
Who, by the way, we both love.
Yeah, no, he does a great job. I mean, he gets into it and he has great guests, but we don't need to get into that. That's the distraction, right? The reason why this is all very important is because there is a connection between somebody who absconded with millions, potentially billions of dollars that was earned from victims of financial fraud, who is now getting the president on his plane, visiting the White House 17 times in just a few years, and even a dozen times in the span of a week, likely working on something. And what Epstein clearly got out of that deal was that he was able to avoid prosecution for financial fraud. His crimes were swept under the rug, and he was allowed out so that he could go and do what he wanted to. Now, Sean, I think it's a great idea that we jump into what happened with Acosta now, because this is also what gets a little crazy. And we can kind of gloss over this because there's a lot of reporting, but in order to wrap this up, I think that we need to get into Acosta. So Jeffrey Epstein is ultimately indicted, right? He goes to grand jury and he gets charged in Florida. In Florida, the attorney general, who I believe at that time was the attorney general under Jeb Bush, not necessarily a friend of Bill Clinton, decided to go after Epstein. Why? Because I think that the complaints were racking up a little bit too high, right? We had these girls coming forward with complaints. I believe there was quite a crazy investigation that was done by the Miami Herald that uncovered Epstein's philandering and his abuse of underage people. And I think that an attorney general wanted to get to the bottom of it. Well, oftentimes we would see a case like that taken by a federal U.S. attorney's office. Oftentimes we would have seen Epstein's financial fraud taken by a U.S. attorney's office. But in this case, it was prosecuted by the state, and it came time to negotiate a deal. And something that was brought out in the most recent records dump related to Epstein is actually the most important thing in this case. It's a memo from Acosta, and it details the federal government's decision to be involved in the Florida plea agreement. Epstein was indicted. He was charged with, I believe it was prostitution. He ultimately pled to that, served 13 months on work release, kind of the lightest sentence he ever could have gotten of an 18-month sentence. And in addition, the federal government decided that they were essentially going to give him immunity for the deal because Florida had prosecuted him, something that you almost never see. Epstein was represented by no other than Ken Starr at the time. That's a fun fact. Ken Starr, the guy who went after Clinton, is representing Epstein. And I imagine if Epstein went to Ken Starr and he said, hey, I've got all of this information, right? Maybe you don't want to have me singing like a canary about all of the stuff that has gone on. Maybe that was a reason why Ken Starr might aggressively defend him. And the deal that Ken Starr works out is almost unheard of. He goes to Acosta, who's the U.S. attorney at the time, and Acosta says in this memo, Jeffrey Epstein wants to make sure that he is not charged federally for this, and I'm paraphrasing. He wants to just plead to the state charges, which I don't have a problem with, he says. And so they elect to give him immunity from that prosecutor's office, from federal charges, despite the fact that the issues that Epstein was involved in, again, not saying certain words, I don't want to make light of the situation, but there's just certain topics we're not going to talk about. And despite the fact that this would have happened across state lines, we see the federal government not get involved and specifically say, we're not going to go forward and charge Jeffrey Epstein. So there's no charges. There's essentially immunity. And the conduct that was being looked at was going back into the early 2000s. And this was mid 2000s is when the Acosta investigation goes down. Kenneth Starr and Acosta actually have a very good relationship, a long-standing relationship, which was one of the reasons why Jeffrey Epstein decided to hire Ken Starr in order to defend him. That certainly smoothed things over with Acosta, and Acosta cut a deal that would ultimately be overturned by a judge as being illegal. And he cut a deal that ultimately would result in an Office of Professional Responsibility investigation that would basically absolutely dunk Acosta. But despite that, Acosta still becomes, Labor Secretary eventually, Sean? I think he still ultimately gets promoted and gets through confirmation, which is absolutely shocking, okay? He cuts this deal. He doesn't respect victims. And a federal judge later on issues a compelling opinion that says Acosta failed to properly represent the victims. He failed to properly notify the victims. And this deal was so good, Sean, this is the most shocking thing I learned about the deal. This deal from Acosta also included immunity from federal prosecution for 4 unnamed co-conspirators and any other potential co-conspirators. Have you ever seen, you do a lot of expert witness work, Have you ever seen a deal with one individual that offered immunity for 4 other unnamed individuals in that deal?
No, it's mind boggling. How does a judge sign off on something like this?
They don't have to. They don't have to. Yeah. It's beautiful.
This is corruption at the highest levels.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is the beauty of non-prosecution, right? It doesn't have to go through a court because the federal government never charged Epstein. So in 2008, Acosta strikes this deal that says, we're not going to prosecute you and 4 special super secret friends that you decide to name that nobody else is going to talk about. And in exchange, you plead guilty to state charges and you do 18 months essentially on work release, allowing him to leave the jail for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. I mean, was he still abusing people while he was on work release? I think that's likely, right? And then after you're done with all of that, you still get to be on the president's jet. There's nothing wrong with that. You can still do that. The president's jet is apparently less secure than a middle school, which Jeffrey Epstein wouldn't have been allowed to be near because he was, guess what, a registered sex offender. That's quite crazy. But the other thing that Acosta did with this plea deal is that he kept it secret from the victims, which violated something called the Crime Victims' Rights Act. And that's later what a federal judge used to declare this essentially unlawful. According to various reports, including statements by Acosta himself, because he was asked about this stuff, there were concerns about the reliability of victim testimony and the difficulty of securing convictions in federal court. That's what they say. But remember, Jeffrey Epstein was charged and arrested in 2019. He was coming back on his private jet, right? And he was arrested, and he was arrested for offenses. And this is the one fact that caused me to be very suspicious about all of this. He was arrested only for the same conduct that formed the basis of the state conviction in Florida. He wasn't arrested for other stuff, more recent stuff. He wasn't arrested for continuing to do this. He wasn't arrested for anything he did the Thursday before or the Friday before. He was arrested for stuff that happened back in 2005. Now, you have Acosta saying, we don't have enough witnesses, kind of, sort of. You know, it's really hard to try a case. It's really hard to try a case when you have like an international money launderer who's also swindled people of billions of dollars and also happens to have these people of a certain age coming to his place and who are willing to move forward and testify. It's really hard, according to Acosta, to try that case. Well, according to Barr and according to Donald Trump and according to whoever was making decisions in the Southern District of New York, I don't know if Preet was still around at that time, but I think maybe there might have been something about Preet's departure that has to do with this because he struggled. Remember, he struggled with leaving the Southern District of New York at that time. And we wonder why. We wonder why he struggled to leave. And I'm going to look through the case, and maybe we'll do a second episode as to how the timing lines up with Preet Bharara's departure and his struggles departing and this case. But we know that they were fully willing to try that case in 2019, and they were able to get a conviction even against Maxwell, a co-conspirator. So, Sean, how good is Acosta at evaluating a case when somebody else decides to take up that case against a co-conspirator and ultimately prosecute it, leading to the conviction for 20 years of the co-conspirator?
It's unbelievable.
Not so good.
As much as you've gone into this and as much as I've been looking at this as well, I just feel like we're scratching the surface of this thing, man. I mean, the tentacles on this thing, the layers that it goes, how deep into the Justice Department does this thing go? How deep into Bill Clinton's presidency does this thing go? Because this is unbelievable.
A lot of conspiracy theorists get this wrong. There's not a lot of agreements to be had in cabals like this. Nobody's really agreeing to things. There's motivations, and there's alignment of motivations. And when those motivations align, skilled people like Jeffrey Epstein are able to play those motivations to get people to engage in predictable actions that are helpful for them, right? This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is a collection of motivations. Acosta is the U.S. attorney in Florida who Epstein needs a good deal from because somebody went crazy and tried to charge him. That was Acosta. Who does Jeffrey Epstein go to? Ken Starr. Why? Because Ken Starr and Acosta are pretty good buddies, and he has the ability to get Ken Starr interested in the case. Epstein is about to be federally investigated. A U.S. attorney in Chicago is looking into him. What does he do? He goes to Middleton. Hook me up with your boy Bill. Get me into the White House. Let me talk to some people. I will let them know what I can do. And this little federal case is going to go bye-bye. So deep, sure. A lot of people may have engaged in actions that were kind of on the fuzzy side of the law or maybe even completely over it, right? Acosta was never prosecuted for what he did here. Nobody ever found that Acosta was engaging in fraud. But he was acting consistent with his motivations in this case. There's just one more layer to this, which gets really interesting here. Vince Foster. This is a name that has been through the press a lot. The same day that Hillary Clinton was scheduled to speak at the Democratic National Convention, some documents came out that she was, I guess, behind a delay in releasing the suicide note from Vince Foster that was apparently left when he purportedly killed himself. Now, the way that Vince Foster's death in 1993 is a big year for this whole situation, the way this death was handled, and the fact that some documents may have been removed from White House counsel Vince Foster's office impeded the official search of his office and was subjected to some pretty intense scrutiny by drumroll, Ken Starr. Now, I'm not just making silly connections here, right?
No, this is a logical connection.
We've got Ken Starr investigating the death of Vince Foster. He's got information about the death of Vince Foster, but he doesn't go forward and prosecute anybody related to that. He hits Bill Clinton for the Monica Lewinsky scandal. They go with the sex, right? But they don't go with the Vince Foster situation. Why? Is it possible that maybe Ken Starr wanted to hold a little something back? Hold a little information back, right? Maybe hold a little information back that maybe Jeffrey Epstein was able to use and leverage at his disposal. So there was a newly released memo written by White House lawyer Miriam Nemitz. I'm quoting this from CNN. Now, this was CNN a while ago, it's like pre-Don Lemon, I guess we would say. There's like pre-Don Lemon and post-Don Lemon. And now Don Lemon is a different Don Lemon, which is just the most fascinating switcheroo I've ever seen. I wonder if Anderson Cooper is going to go the same way. That would be fascinating. But there's this memo. White House Chief of Staff Mac McLarty said that Clinton was very upset and believed the matter, meaning Vince Foster's death, required further thought and that the president should not be told about Vince Foster's suicide note. According to the documents, Ms. Clinton said they should have a coherent position and should be able to decide what to do before they told the president. Now, those statements, and I'm just jumping right to it, contradicted the sworn testimony of Senate Whitewater to the Senate Whitewater Committee from Clinton staffers that the First Lady had no role whatsoever in the handling of Vince Foster's suicide note. What was so important about Vince Foster's suicide note, and why are we talking about it? Because it absolves Hillary Clinton of some financial issues related to the funding of one of her charities, which has been a constant source of scrutiny. Now, CNN is saying this. I'm not saying this. But what does Vince Foster have to do with all of this? He dies in 1993. He dies of an apparent suicide. A suicide note is found much later. It is not brought forward by anybody. Hillary Clinton's staffers say that she had no role in the death of Vince Foster, no role in the suicide note handling. But then later on, we learn that Hillary Clinton herself said, we need to hold this from the president for a while because we need to have an official position on Vince Foster's death. She's holding information from her husband. Now, some people could say we hold this information to have an official position. Some people could say we hold this information in order to get our story together.
Hillary Clinton, from the earliest of days, controlled that White House.
Oh,
there
yeah.
are so many stories about violence between Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton transpiring, and her throwing dishes and her. Let me tell you something. Hillary Clinton, for all intents and purposes, ran that presidency.
Absolutely.
There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And if you or I or any other regular red-blooded American man did the things in his marriage that he did to Hillary Clinton, our wives would have been gone a long time ago. Why does a woman like that stick around? It's for power. It's for influence. It's for money. It's because she had her finger on the button and she had full control, and she knew damn well that Vince Foster's death was anything but a suicide, because there was still a lot of questions, if you go and you look, about the manner, even though it's a single gunshot wound to the head. There's a lot of things that point to the improbability that the angle and the way it was done could have been self-inflicted.
For Middleton?
No, for Foster.
For Foster? Yeah. I didn't look too much into the forensics. I just think this note is very important. And my hope is that we can actually show a copy of that note. I think we'll have to find one and give people a chance to read it, because the language of the note is the most curious thing, right? We've got somebody who is contemplating taking their life and talking about, Hillary Clinton here. And that's just a very bizarre miscalculation. But we know that if we search the archives, just to wrap this up, Sean, we search the archives, we see the file of none other than Brett Kavanaugh. We can also show part of this file. And Brett Kavanaugh was actually assigned as part of the investigation along with Kenneth Starr. Brett Kavanaugh later became a hotly contested justice of the United States Supreme Court. I don't know. He didn't have any role other than investigation. I'm not saying that he was involved in anything else. It just happens to be how power kind of runs, right? You've got people in powerful circles associated with Ken Starr. And when you're in that powerful circle, even as a young Brett Kavanaugh, you're able to stay in positions where you can consolidate power. Well, when we look at these archives from Brett Kavanaugh's file, we see memos related to Ken Starr. We see some information, including an article that was printed out and put in Brett Kavanaugh's file from the Pittsburgh Tribune Review. Now, probably small newspaper, but on October 25th, 1995, we see a fax line on the top of that, which we can show the audience here. Experts say Foster suicide note forged. That was copied and printed and put in Kavanaugh's file. It's a news article that essentially says the suicide note may very well be forged. And who would have forged it? Maybe the people who took a long time to bring it to the attention of anybody, including the President of the United States.
Is it President Hillary Clinton or President Bill Clinton?
Oh, President Bill Clinton. Yeah. Hillary Clinton wasn't able to get over the Donald Trump hump during the election. That five magical points that were being kept from the polls because two people are too embarrassed to say that they supported Donald Trump. But we have this investigative file, and we have a letter on July 13th, 1993, copied and placed into this file to the Honorable Janet Reno, the Attorney General of the United States at the time, that related to the White House Travel Office Management Review, the White House report, right? That was really, really important back then with respect to the Travelgate scandal, which Vince Foster was right in the middle of. Maybe he took his life as a result of this investigation. In the file that is investigating that death, we see that there are reports related to Travelgate. we see that there are insinuations, in fact, maybe even outright statements that kind of make it pretty clear.
But he was deputy assistant counsel. And let me tell you something. Somebody like Vince Foster had to have enough of a treasure trove of information that if things went sideways and he was targeted as part of an investigation, or he was going to be criminally indicted or what have you, there's no way that this guy didn't have enough information to be able to strike a plea agreement, get some kind of immunity deal, get a cooperation agreement, whatever it is, put him into WITSAC, something. The fact that you have Middleton dying of a gunshot, hanged from a tree, and then you got Foster, who's 48 years old. Yep. There was never any handwritten analysis of that note done, right? Still, today hasn't been done.
That's right.
And to label these two guys as a suicide when there's so many other elements that point to nefarious behavior, point to suspicious causes of death, I think is absolutely mind-boggling to me. And I think this is a topic that I think you and I should take some more time. Maybe we find some people who have something to say about it, and maybe we can get them to engage with us a little bit more and do another episode, because I think this is so fascinating, because who knows if this thing stops at the Clintons politically? Who else could be compromised from a political aspect?
Oh yeah, no, it's quite crazy. There are just a couple of notes that I want to get into from this Kavanaugh file, and I don't know what this is related to, because it just seems to be like scratch notes, maybe written down. They might have been Kavanaugh's notes. They may be somebody else's. Maybe these were the notes of an investigator. It just doesn't say. But I mean, first there was a report from Chelsea Clinton's babysitter that called up and said Vince Foster essentially walked to his car and shot himself in the head. That was the report. Let me get to the bottom of it. It's page 39 of this archives file that we're going to show everybody here. But this is to certify that on the 20th day of July, 1993, I received a phone call from Roger Perry of the Arkansas State Police, who was a member of the Arkansas governor's security staff. Perry advised me that he had just received a telephone call from one Helen Dickey, a former babysitter for Chelsea Clinton, who was employed at the White House, and that she had advised him that Vince Foster, known to both Perry and me, had gone to his car on the parking lot and had shot himself in the head. I don't recall the exact time of the call, but I placed it as being during the rush hour at the White House and assumed there must be many witnesses to the event. Were there? I don't know. Perry advised me that Dickey was quite upset, as if the event had happened shortly before her call to him. I estimate the time being no later than 6 o'clock Central Standard Time. The eyewitness that reports the death, former babysitter for Chelsea Clinton. I mean, that just sounds weird, right?
Yeah, it does. But everything with the Clintons sounds weird.
When we get up to these notes that were in the Kavanaugh document, there's mention of a belief that the body under cannon number 2 in the line of fire is ludicrous. I'm not sure what that really relates to. But later on, it said that Ken needs to hire an experienced murder prosecutor. And it suggested that the way the gun was staged. I saw that when I was doing research for this case, and I about fell off my chair. We have an actual document in the archives, the federal archives, that says that Ken Starr should hire a murder prosecutor. But did Ken Starr hire a murder prosecutor? We also have mentioned that the gun allegedly found in Foster's hand was, quote, unquote, staged. There's also other facts. Some eyewitnesses apparently saying the body was transported in a van to the park where Vince Foster died. The van pulled into the second parking lot on Chainbridge Road across from the Saudi ambassador's residence. The body was then carried directly from the gate by the second parking lot to the position near cannon number 1. I think that cannon means some sort of monument. We could research this later and take a look.
Yeah.
The straight path there, and that the gun allegedly found in Vince Foster's hand was staged. Now, eyewitnesses say crazy things. Sometimes you get people who don't know a lot about a lot and they want to make up lies. It's very possible that these are the scratch notes of some witness who absolutely lacks any credibility. But the Ken Starr needs to hire a murder prosecutor. And the fact that this wasn't really further looked into is one of the most strange things. And the fact that we have Ken Starr and Acosta having such a relationship is quite odd. Sean, I think we got to jump into an episode number 2, like you said, potentially with a guest here. But I will tell you that I have not found any instance in our history where any single person was able to get away with something like this that Epstein did so in the open and then get away with it again. And then when he finally faced charges, those charges had nothing to do with the massive fraud that he engaged in. And we've got victims who are without compensation for what they went through. Sean, this shows all about the fact that there are 2 systems of justice in this country, right? And we're going to say the difficult things that we need to, that people need to hear to understand that there are 2 systems of justice in this country. And I can't find evidence, better evidence of 2 systems of justice in this country when 200,000 victims of massive financial fraud don't get to be compensated, right? And when a plea deal is struck by a U.S. attorney that names 4 random people, friends of Jeffrey Epstein, immunity, gives them immunity for federal charges, that is just the most outlandish thing I've ever heard of, Sean. And these types of things shouldn't happen in our country. So hopefully those people watching come through this with a different set of glasses when they look at the reporting and don't follow the distractions, the noise of the media when they're covering these types of events. That's what we've got for you.
I agree. All right. Well, before we go, once again, I want to say to all of our followers, all of the listeners of the podcast on whatever podcast platform you find us on, please go and check out my good friend Randy Couture's Extreme Couture GI Foundation right here, helping veterans in need. You won't find a better charity and a better guy leading the way. So that's going to be a wrap for today's episode. Remember, just like Colonel Nathan Jessup says, you want us on that wall. You need us on that wall. Ron and I are here to bring you the discussions and insights you need. If you enjoyed today's show, remember, make sure you click and survive and leave us a review. It really makes a difference. Again, we want to hear your thoughts, so reach out on social media or visit our website. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on The Wall.